It's an Archaeo-Death interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest. Welcome, Archaeo-Deathlings, to yet another Archaeo-Death interview with a super special medieval mead gobbling, guzzling, quaffing. I don't know. We'll have to discuss what is the best term for how you drink mead as well as what you drink it. But we have a mead discussion with Simon. Please, Simon, introduce yourself and save me from a rambling introduction.
Thanks very much, Howard. Hello there. And here I have my glass of mead. My glass of mead. I will quaff.
You must quaff.
To start off with.
Like a Viking. Oh, that was
quaffed.
That was 100% Viking.
That was more of a delicate sip. That was a bit more academic. That was sherry in the senior common room, I'm afraid. But it should have been a bit more hearty and full.
Yeah.
Yes. And I should have roared, and it should have been out of a horn, no doubt. But hello, yes, Howard. I'm Simon. We've known each other for 1,000,000 years.
Beyond time itself.
I know. And I am Senior Lecturer in Medieval History at the Institute of Historical Research, University of London. And yes, what else can I say?
Well, I mean, you're an expert in almost everything, but I remember you from I'm reading your work as I think I was still a student when I first read your publications, and then you were working on early medieval ethnicity, and you've done so many things since. It's but now you're in the realms of alcohol in the early Middle Ages and our modern Vikingisms, Viking reconstruct, or just medievalisms, our reconstructed ideas of the past. And so I'm really, I mean, obviously you've had an article out, a book chapter, forgive me, out already on this topic, and you've got imminent further publications. So we'll put those all in the description. So anyone who wants to learn more, you won't just have to stop here. You can read and learn more. But I just want to start off by getting that sense of how did you get to, before we get into the mead, how did you get to this topic? How did your research lead you to drink, drive you to drink?
It often does. It really often does, to be honest. But no, in respect of this, I was looking at all sorts of things to do with reception of the Vikings, modern constructions of the Vikings, masculinity in Vikings in particular, which is obviously a very big thing, the way that we tend to picture, or when I say we, popular culture, let me shift it away slightly. Popular culture tends to conceive of these very hyper-masculine, very sort of hearty Vikings who eat a lot, drink a lot, kill a lot. They are and that is a sort of a stereotype of the Vikings and how they work in popular culture. But the thing that particularly drew me to this, actually of all things, was watching a video online on YouTube or somewhere of Amon Amarth, the Viking metal band, showing their fans how to brew mead, how to make mead. And there was something just so adorable about this video, actually, because they were just so into it, and so they're small boys, really, when it comes down to talking about the Vikings and enthusing about the Vikings. But they were talking about mead and it being a special Viking drink and something that is very characteristically Viking. And the way they were talking about it was very much in terms of drinking lots, falling over in a ditch, that being great fun. But there are certain ideas that were coming forward there. Firstly, that mead is a particular drink of the Vikings, which may or may not be true. There are questions around that, shall we say,
we can get back to that,
which I will go into in a bit. But there's also something a bit about the way that Vikings drink and the way that we as Vikings fans, enthusiasts, be we reenactors or Amon Amarth fans or players of Assassin's Creed Valhalla or people who watch the History Channel Viking series, all of this sort of all of these people who are enthusing about the Vikings and perhaps wanting to drink like the Vikings, there are certain messages about how we do that. That it's plentiful, it is fun. There's also a certain idea of you can probably take your beer or your mead or whatever it is, but even if you don't, you just fall over, you fall into a ditch, and it doesn't matter. We're all together in this, and that struck me as interesting.
Yeah.
And from that, I wrote an article, a book chapter, which has already come out,
Yes.
which is looking at the idea of Vikings and alcohol, why we think of them in those terms, having a little bit of a look at the early medieval evidence for drinking. I've now got another book chapter coming out soon, which is specifically on mead and why we think of that as a Viking drink, whether we are justified in thinking of that as a Viking drink, and just generally thinking about the very particular character that we give to mead. You were saying earlier on that it's maybe something that we quaff, and think of that verb that we apply to it. We're quaffing it. We're not just drinking it. It's a sort of, there's a whole heartiness and a performance to the drinking of mead that you don't really get with any other drink, I think. That sort of sense that it is historical, and that by drinking it, we're not just having something that quenches our thirst or makes us a bit merry. We're engaging in a discussion with the past.
So that participation, that sociality of, but not one of just going down the pub in a, and having a slightly, I'll have a glass of white wine, please, rather than, I'm having a tankard. It's not that kind of ye olde sort of British thing. It's something deeper. It's something more noble and spiritual in a sense, isn't it? And it takes us back to the Herot and Beowulf and stuff. Yeah, but we get to that, I know. But it does that sense of you are something antique, something archaic. I don't know, primordial even.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, one of the things that you will often see that mead makers stick all over their websites, and that you will often see on the back label of a mead bottle, if you happen to have one to hand, is quite frequently the mead is the oldest drink oldest alcoholic drink that there is, the oldest drink known to humanity, or oldest alcoholic drink known to humanity. And then there will tend to be a reeling off of a list of people who probably drank mead, citing various bits and pieces cobbled together, either of archaeological evidence of vessels where there are traces of honey, or of a few of bits and pieces of mythological or literary evidence from various different peoples at various different times. So you'll see it as part of the Rig Veda being mentioned as that sort of Sanskrit. You'll see it as something the Romans and the Greeks did, but perhaps most of all, you will see it as something that the Vikings did, and that is a really strong theme.
But it's like, I mean, I've been thinking about this in terms of popular renditions since the 19th century of the history of cremation, nothing to do with me here, that there's this different websites, different undertakers. So it's become commercialized that you'd give a pot history of whatever you're selling, and you go, the ancient Greeks did this, in the Homer's Iliad, and then, they burnt the dead, and then the Romans, and then you go Vikings. And in other words, it's not so much about those periods as much as deep time. You're giving that backstory that gives a sort of, but there is something specifically that it's not. Then there are those that want a specific connection. There's the look at all this past, but then it's that specific Northern European and then early medieval and then nested within that Vikings. That's so intriguing. I mean, where do we start? Do you want to go back to the early Middle Ages and do a sort of fact check, myth bust? What we actually know. You need a sort of provocatively titled, the real truth behind the lies, the fake news about. Or do you want to start with the present day? Which way do you want to go, Simon?
Let's start with the early Middle Ages. Let's okay. Start back. Let's head back to those sources and think about where this idea, that the idea of Vikings drinking mead, of other early medieval people drinking mead as well, because we have to have a think about that as well, and use the dreaded C word as well. There is a Celtic
that C word. Sorry, there's so many.
All sorts of C words are possible, but in this particular case,
yes. You've said it now. Phew. Right.
Yeah. So thinking about the early medieval sources, I mean, first of all, the thing to say is alcohol is abundant in the early Middle Ages, certainly in various different parts of society. Drinking, the consumption of strong drink is it's more than just a pleasure. It is an implicit part of a warrior culture, of a heroic society that has, for one reason or another, has acquired the name of mead hall culture in the scholarly literature. For better or worse, and clearly by calling it mead hall culture, we therefore associate it with mead in particular. But that the ethos of that is essentially that from the later Iron Age, actually, it predates the early Middle Ages. There is a comitatus structure, a warband structure, with a leader, be that your local lord or your slightly greater lord or your king, who maintains a feasting hall, and in that feasting hall, he provides food and drink, perhaps mead, perhaps beer, perhaps whatever it may be, but plenty of this, and that is the price of the allegiance of that comitatus. So it is firmly embedded in that heroic warrior culture right across Northern Europe. You see this in England, you see it in Scandinavia, you see it in the Frankish lands, you see it in the Celtic lands, or whatever we want to call them, Wales and Ireland. It's this sort of heroic mead hall culture is quite a standard feature, and has been quite well researched. There's been some all sorts of interesting bits and pieces of research done on this. But what's really important here is the transaction of I give you alcohol and food, and you give me loyalty. And you see this cropping up as particularly in poetry, where people have been killed, and there will be a sort of saying, bitter is that mead. The point being there that this person has given their loyalty and died in battle as a result, but that was part of the honourable transaction and the relationship between that leader and his warband. The leader gave mead, that person gave their life. So it's a bitter mead as opposed to a sweet mead.
And the mead is not simply just the taking of the drink, it's in the hall with gestures and ceremony, songs and poetry, women being the givers, maybe, not always, but, the whole culture of the hall is part of that consumption, isn't it? So the mead stands for that whole ceremony in stylized terms. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, it very much does. I mean, if you think of the Beowulf example, for example, or if you think of any of these occasions when poetry is being read, or actually an awful lot of just the social transactions that are going on, the place that things happen is this. And if you look, the mise en scène, the place, the backdrop to an awful lot of the big social events, or to the competitive poetry, or to the telling of deeds, that's all happening in the mead hall, and it has this highly romanticized, idealized feel, as though that is part of the good society. That's the ideal of what warrior society should be like if it's functioning well. People should be sitting on their benches, and eating and drinking and telling stories and hearing the heroic tales of deeds which have been done or whatever. That's the sort of thing that happens. And yes, they are being served with mead, perhaps even by very high status women. Which is all again part of the transaction, which lies at the centre of this whole idea of drinking mead. So that's what you see in Beowulf. In Beowulf, we have these big halls. We have Heorot. We have various places. We have equally, if you go to Norse mythology, Valhalla or Valhalla, whatever you want to call it, is again this idealized picture of the wonderful heroic warrior society, where in the case of Valhalla, that they're already dead. They're not going to die again. So you're being feasted with all of this, with mead or wine or alcohol, whatever it may be, and it's an idea of heaven. It's an idea of actually what is perfect.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just moving on from there.
I mean, did that actually happen? Sorry, interject. I mean, do we think that was actually a reality, or is that a stylization of some time before, a nostalgia?
Yeah, I mean, the hall exists for certain.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. But in terms of what is consumed in it,
That's what I meant, yeah.
I think. Yeah, I think there are some pretty clear signs that actually thinking of it in terms of mead that's being consumed is very much a nostalgic and rather sort of, it places it in a heroic, lovely sort of past. It's a golden age drinking a golden drink of mead. But there are some good reasons to doubt whether actually it's mead that's being consumed very often. So let me say a little bit about those. And here I very much want to acknowledge I'm basing this on work by other people, in particular Christine Fell, who did some work on this 50 years ago, actually, for the mid-70s, looking at the words for alcohol, which we see in Old English, and the other source for this is Fernando Guerrero Rodriguez, who wrote a PhD thesis in 2007 at the University of York, who looked at the evidence for alcohol in the West Norse sources. So that's effectively Icelandic and to a certain extent Norwegian sources, on which are a little bit later, and there are questions about that we need to think about. But it's based on their work. But what both of them have managed to show, and Christine Fell in particular, is that all the words, all the times that mead is mentioned, mead is far more often mentioned in poetic contexts. And the same is also true in the Norse sources as well. It tends to be in Eddic or Skaldic verse in the Norse sources. It doesn't tend to be in that rather more practical sort of source that we have in the charters or the laws. It just isn't mentioned very often, which leads you to begin to wonder what's going on here. And what Fell goes on to say is that where we do encounter mead, and where we encounter compound words which are generated from mead, they tend to be very much in sort of emotive contexts. So the mead path is, or the mead plain or the mead hall, or the mead benches. These are the mead path is a path that you go through in order to get to a mead hall. That's not a very practical. It's a far more poetic sort of.
Yeah.
What it's describing is what you're thinking about as you go up the path. Or the mead plain, which is the plain in which there is one of these halls. Again, it's what you're thinking about. So it's far more to do with your emotional response to this substance. Whereas the compound words which are formed on various other on the various other drinks that we know about. So ealu, which is ale, or öl in Old Norse, that will have far more practical compounds, which are ale barrel or ale tap, or these words which are far more likely to be used in the process of making it or transporting it, or you name it. They're far more practical sorts of words, compound words, which leads Fell to think, with regard to the Old English sources, and Guerrero Rodriguez with respect to the Old Norse sources, makes them think that actually what we're looking at is mead as a sort of, as this idealized, slightly mythological, slightly strange drink, slightly otherworldly almost, of a previous golden age. So yes, it's talked about, but it's talked about in a very particular way, which makes you query if it's actually the thing which is being drunk. And certainly once you get into normal average farmhouses, is it mead that's being drunk, or is it small beer? It's far more likely to be the sort of everyday drink of the Vikings at home is far more likely to be beer, or various other alternatives.
So could you would it be pushing beyond our source evidence to imagine some kind of hierarchy did exist? Mead could have been drunk by some in small quantities to mark them off from the rest of the hoi polloi, the great unwashed. I mean, that it had some kind of, it was either, and the mythology is of when everyone had it, and we're now, or do you think it was always a rare or unusual drink? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that it's hard to tell, and I mean, and here we, to a certain extent, we've got to be arguing back from relatively late written sources, and we can't. There's not really. I mean, basically, we are using the written sources here. There's not much that we can get from archaeology or from anything else. So, but we're arguing back from Beowulf in particular, which is late 10th, early 11th. There is doubt around that, shall we say? But certainly it is looking back to an earlier period. The events it describes are early 6th century.
Yeah.
And so very considerably removed from an absolutely earliest possible date for the writing of Beowulf. Likewise, but equally the sources that we think we know about mead in Norse culture from. So in particular, the idea of mead being drunk in Valhalla, those are very late indeed. Those are 13th century. So we're trying to look back from those sources with almost nothing to go on. But I think you can pretty realistically say that there may have been a point when mead was the high status drink.
Right. Okay.
Before. But then that gets us into all sorts of interesting arguments about when wine starts to be becoming available in the north, because really interestingly, in the Norse sources, we find that Odin, the chief god, drinks wine, and that is really interesting because sure, for the Einherjar, for the heroes in Valhalla, it's fine for them as very high status people. They are drinking this idealized drink, but head honcho drinks wine because that is the absolute, that is the pinnacle of the social hierarchy of drinks. And what that has all sorts of implications of extreme long distance trade, of being obtained from the Mediterranean, and being Mediterranean is good in this sort of context. Possibly slightly later, of course, wine has connotations of Christianity, and perhaps in a slightly different example, post-Norman conquest, wine becomes very much the status drink in England, as there is the introduction of a French aristocracy, or a Frankified aristocracy that has become very used to wine as the top status drink. So yeah.
What happens to that then? Where does mead go? So, I mean, I also, can I just quickly ask, because we're going to come back to this, do we have any early medieval evidence of monastic mead production, this kind of this holy mead stylization, or is there a real venerable mead? I only asked the question to get in the pun there, but is there any sort of anything in that?
No, not in the early Middle Ages. No. There's or I mean, no, not in terms of the written evidence. There, I think in England there may be a few bits and pieces of charter evidence where certain amount of mead is being supplied on a yearly basis.
No explicit or exclusive relationship with ecclesiastical communities.
Not with monasteries. No, not in the early Middle Ages at all.
Right.
It's not. Yeah, no. It's later on. Yes, perhaps more, but no, not in the early Middle Ages. It's a later thing.
So sorry, I had to ask that, but yes. So what happens to mead afterwards then?
Right. So basically, there's it gets squeezed at both ends, almost certainly, which sounds horrible, but in essence, beer or ale, let's be specific in our terminology here, ale is the drink of the masses, be it sort of weaker, small beer, sort of weak ale, or slightly stronger, and that is the typical drink of everybody, really, even right up to the upper classes. It is something that almost everybody is drinking. In the later Middle Ages, you start to see ale. Ale is basically produced in the home, probably mostly by women. Domestic production, localized production, up until the introduction of hopping. Prior to the use of hops as a flavour, it's a variety of other things that are used: bog myrtle, marsh rosemary, meadowsweet, various botanicals is what they would be called nowadays. And that's how you flavour your beer. Hops begin to be introduced at an uncertain date. I mean, people are using hops possibly 10th, 11th century, but it's only really a bit later that they begin to be used on a large scale. So sort of 13th, 14th. Hops allow for a bit of flavour, but they also allow beer to keep longer. And that leads to the replacement of unhopped ale by hopped beer. And that in turn then leads to something far more like an industrial production of beer. Tends to be so shifts out of the home, tends to be something that is being produced on a larger scale, tends to be dominated by men, who start to have these centralized breweries, but you get economies of scale, it becomes very cheap, and beer becomes even more ubiquitous than it already was. So at that end of it's being squeezed there. At the top end of the scale, wine is the drink of the aristocracy. It does have, obviously it does have Christian connotations as well, because of its use in Christian ritual, and that means that mead probably gets squeezed out by wine, since there is something that just seems a bit more exotic, a bit more interesting, that has Mediterranean connotations, that has Christian connotations, which means that mead is displaced. Certainly also, you begin to wonder about the availability of honey. Honey in the north, certainly there's reason to think that mead that is being drunk in Scandinavia may well be made with honey from further south. It may be with honey from England or from the Mediterranean. So there may be a question over whether you can really produce. I mean, bees produce honey certainly in southern Scandinavia. Once you start getting up into North Norway, North Sweden, it becomes. I mean, again, there are honeybees there, but you're not going to get very high production in those areas. So one way or another, it's expensive. It may be that you have a little ice age effect as well, that the global cooling between about the 14th and the 17th century, 17th, 18th century, may actually also reduce honey yields, and again, maybe another thing that is causing mead to disappear.
Factors play into it in multiple factors. Yeah,
absolutely, sure, yeah. So mead doesn't entirely disappear. It is still sort of kicking around in the late Middle Ages, in the early modern period. In some places in Europe, it maintains quite a lot of production right the way through. In the Baltic area, in Poland, in what are now the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, there's partly due to the fact that those are relatively thinly populated areas, and you have very dense forests.
That's true.
You have large scale what's called forest honey production.
Right.
And that seems to mean that mead remains quite a big thing in that sort of within that Baltic area, and it remains quite an important drink there right the way through. But in Western and Northern Europe, it begins to fade out. Charles II definitely had some mead, or metheglin, which is flavoured mead. Because, and we know about this because Samuel Pepys went and drank some of it, which the king had left behind, and Samuel Pepys stole into a table and went and drank Charles II's mead, and he notes this in his diary as a thing that he did. So it's still knocking around, but by the particularly once really massive scale beer kicks in the 19th century, it can't compete with that. By the sort of end of the 19th century, if mead is being produced at all, it's very, very locally, right, in country areas where you have a hive of honey, and when you're cleaning it out at the end, you're left with a mixture of honey and water, and you just turn that into mead, because why not? and so it's sort of rural. It's that production is almost non-existent certainly in England by about 1900. We have a couple of sources which say that it's very sad that this wonderful drink is something that only farmers make.
So it doesn't disappear. So it's not a complete reinvention, but it is the modern mead industry is largely a recreation. I mean,
it is. I mean, because and the interesting thing here is that at that point when any sort of organic tradition of this drink sort of continuing through is really starting to become completely attenuated and almost vanishing, is, as it happens, the point at which mead as this sort of heroic drink of the early medieval past is starting to appear in popular culture, or at first in aristocratic or high culture, and then it starts to make its way into popular culture. So, for instance, Wagner. Let's always turn to Wagner. I mean, if it's a thing about popular culture and the Vikings, then probably Wagner had something to do with it. So
responsible for a lot.
He certainly is. So at the end of Act 1 of Rheingold, which I think is the first of the ring cycle, there's a moment at which Siegmund has passed out and is revived with mead by Sieglinde. I mean, I don't know if mead is necessarily the right thing to revive you, but so she gives him a horn of mead, and this perks him up, and from there it then starts to, with that idea in mind and with an idea of the Vikings as these hearty drinkers, which is certainly there in the saga source. I mean, it's there, but it starts to be reintroduced into popular culture, and we see it in various places. So the Vikings, Tony Curtis, 1958. Tony Curtis, Kirk Douglas. At the heart of that film is a massive drunken banquet where nobody actually mentions mead.
I was going to ask, right? Okay.
Nobody mentions mead, but but they are there with their horns. And here also note the material adjunct of this horns. I mean, yes, horned helmets, of course, we all know that's nonsense, but horns as part of the Viking kit, it's a really important part of the Viking kit. So the things that we know about that our popular culture Vikings have are axes, they have beards, they don't have horned helmets, but we can joke about them having horned helmets. They have longships with dragon carved prows and stripy red and white sails, and those are the things that we know that they have. But one of the things that they always have is this horn to drink out of, and it's sort of, and they drink out of a horn. And the fact that we've got that as part of the standard kit, and that has come through from late 19th century art. It's come through from a variety of sources. It's come through from Wagner. It's come through from the costumes that were being used in the original productions of Wagner. It comes through in things like the Vikings, but then also Tolkien. Tolkien has his characters drink mead. The dwarfs drink mead in The Hobbit. The hall in Rohan, the
Mediseld,
Mediseld, that means meat hall in Old English. And that is a word taken directly from Beowulf. So that evocation of mead creeps in popular culture, and it becomes part of that standard Viking idea. The Vikings are drinking huge quantities, they are uproarious, they have their feasts, and what do they drink out of their horns at their feasts? It's mead. And so it creeps back in. And that begins to inspire from the 1960s onwards a sort of re-emergence and a rebirth of mead as a drink. Although I'd say that, but there are some interesting points about that rebirth of mead.
Okay.
So the first real sort of new maker of mead. I can presumably mention the trademarks here, but
I don't see why not. We're not selling it.
Yeah. So the first real, the first person or the first people to get into this idea of making mead are Lindisfarne mead on the island of Lindisfarne.
Famously sacked by the Vikings.
Sacked by the Vikings, yes, absolutely. Which is a glorious irony, and they do not play a Viking card at all. They use a label which is the lettering is based on the Lindisfarne Gospels, and it plays to a sort of mystical, medieval, monastic. It doesn't actually mention the monastery as such.
No.
But it's very much we are on this site of a monastery and we are making this medieval sort of drink. And to me, it seems as though this is not so much playing to a Vikings revival, but playing more to the sort of folk revival of the 1960s, and it's sort of playing to those sorts of people, to people who are looking back to a slightly mystical medieval past. And what better thing to drink as you listen to your Steeleye Span albums or whatever it may be?
Gregorian chants and the chants that yet, or was that a little later on?
That's a bit later on. That's more sort of 1980s, 1990s.
That is,
1990s, isn't it? Yeah. So what better thing to drink than your Lindisfarne mead? And they have the playing field more or less to themselves for a good long while. Certainly, I mean, when I were a lad, the only mead that you could get basically was Lindisfarne, and so if that was what you had, but that gradually a few more people start to produce mead. In particular, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you remember Past Times, that rather wonderful
high street
seller of stuff where when you wanted things to give to your auntie for Christmas, it gave you marvelous gifts of medieval niceness. But they started to produce mead as being this sort of part of that sort of nice, pretty medieval. And you begin to get it creeping into English heritage, to the National Trust. It becomes the sort of thing that you buy in castle gift shops.
Yes.
And it's a novelty, but it has that sort of, and that's where this sort of performative nature of mead as it's historical, and the only and the context in which you get it is that sort of historical context. But at the same time, mead is going over to the States, and just as Renaissance fairs are kicking off in the late 60s, early 70s, again under heavy Tolkien influence and a sort of countercultural influence, they start to have this drink from England, which is called mead, and is the sort of thing that people drank in the Middle Ages, isn't it? And from that sort of people going to those Ren fairs, who are also your Society for Creative Anachronism people, they're the people who are reenactors. One thing that reenactors really love is making it for themselves and doing it for themselves. And so lots of these people, realizing that mead is preposterously easy to make. I mean, it's preposterously easy to make badly, but leaving that aside,
if there's a way it can be messed up, I'll do it. But I have
but lots of reenactors start to produce it.
Yes, right.
And this starts to become a sort of little cottage industry among, particularly in the States, actually, to a lesser extent over here as well, but making mead start to become a bit of a thing. And so as you move into this century and you encounter things like the craft beer boom, which to a certain extent is also coming out of a reenactor place, mead sort of hitches a lift on that craft beer bandwagon. That's a mixed metaphor, but anyway, it jumps on the bandwagon of craft beer, and you start to get a very, very serious and large scale mead revival. First of all in the States, but then spreading out right around the world. And you can look at the figures for numbers of world meaderies in about the year 2000, and it's barely in double figures.
Wow.
And then by about 2020, there are thousands of them around the world. There are hundreds of them in the States. There are hundreds of them over here. It becomes this sudden, big, interesting revival.
And how much of that was tied to a medieval aesthetic of monks and knights, and how much to a Viking, or how much versus anything else? I'm just interested in how we, is it always a Celtic or Viking-y association, or?
No, by no means. There's a really interesting thing going on here because obviously the good thing about the sort of traditional audience for mead, the traditional buyers of mead, who in essence are your Vikings fans, are your reenactors, your people who are enthusiastic about the past, or your people. I mean, nowadays it's people who've perhaps played Skyrim and seen mead in Skyrim, or people who've played Assassin's Creed Valhalla and seen it there. They're a good market. They're a strong market, but they're quite a small market. I mean, the way I put it in my chapter is you've got a reliable market of men with beards and their own horns who will go and buy mead. But if you are trying to crack a larger market, you've got to extend beyond that. And really, with mead, what you're trying to do is extend into a large market, which is a wider sort of demographic,
Right.
perhaps younger, perhaps more female. And for that reason, certainly in America and over here, the majority of these new mead makers, whilst they might mention the Vikings occasionally, they will tend to go with a mead is made from honey and is this wonderful, pure, natural product. It isn't your industrial process, and it isn't made nasty refined sugar. It's made with this lovely thing that bees make, and we all like bees. They're lovely.
So it's because bees are natural. This is not simply ancient. It's natural. It's something that's always been. It's timeless. It's a crafting. It has that intimate, like home baked bread. Mass produced in factory, or home. Use the word home. It's that same sort of. Nothing artificial apart from all the food, because all our food is artificial. So,
Yeah, of course it is. But it's sold on this sort of artisan production, which is also what craft beer has sold itself on. Is we're not Budweiser, we're not Heineken, we're not Carling, we're not these crazy massive multinationals who are brewing tens of billions of gallons of beer in that case, but it could also be mead. We are these people who are bringing care and love and character to these small boutique artisan productions that we make, and mead plays that perfectly as this sort of it's this ancient drink that is made from purely naturally from, ideally from honey, water, and yeast, and that's it, and that's all you need. And you can make that is a way of making very, very good mead. But it's also, it has that sort of, well, yes, we all love bees. They're all out there and a part of the countryside. So that is how a lot of mead has been sold. Maybe in this country, in the US, round about 75% of the new mead makers are basing themselves around that sort of purity, artisan values. But you've still got a very solid mass of mead makers, about probably 15% in this country, maybe a bit more in the States, who are very, very Viking, and everything about their mead production is bristlingly Viking, and the bottles have beards and axes and God alone knows what, ravens and the beasts of battle and lots and lots of interlace all over them. So they are attempting to sort of harness that that particular end of the market, which is a substantial and an important end of the market. Also a neo-pagan, because mead has been taken into some neo-pagan ritual as well.
Yes.
And so there's a good solid market there as well, to which some of these mead makers are catering. A particularly interesting thing is where you get mead makers that are aiming at both ends of the market, and selling effectively the same product in different bottles with different labels.
So Odin's mead or Thor's, and then it's whatever.
Then honey mead or whatever, and you will see them. So you'll go to the Jorvik Viking Festival, and they're at the stall with their stall with sort of ravens and spears and God knows what, and helmets, with this stuff which is just bristling with Vikinginess. And then you find that the next week they'll be at a food fair, and they'll be selling the stuff which is in slim, elegant white bottles, and it's basically the same product, to be honest. Yeah. But it's a canny sort of tactic to try to make the best of that hardcore sort of traditional mead drinkers, who are the ones who are buying it who are consuming it in that performative way, and they're going to your Viking festival of choice, and they are swilling it out of their horn or whatever, and having great fun doing it. Why not? I mean, it's a good thing, but that's not enough. If you are trying to make this into the next I don't know, the next Smirnoff Ice, or Wicked, or I don't know what. If you're trying to grab that alcohol market, you want to be selling the stuff in cans. You want to be getting it out onto supermarket shelves. There was a really amusing, interesting thing that happened on Dragon's Den lately, where about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, a chap named Peter Taylor from Nidhogger Mead in York, who is a Viking reenactor, went onto Dragon's Den to sort of try to sell his product and get it taken up by the dragons there. And he put on a display with guys sort of dressed up in chainmail, going and hacking each other with swords and blah, blah, blah. But a really interesting comment there came from one of the dragons, who was saying that ultimately, if you are trying to make mead the next big thing, you can't just rely on all of that. You can't just rely on people with swords and axes. This has got to be the thing that people are, when they are fancy getting something in to go and watch a video, or they're going to the supermarket saying, oh yeah, mead, that's nice. So you can't trade off that Viking thing. It's got to be trading off its other virtues, either its taste or whatever you can portray it as having. And it's a beautiful, it's a really interesting. You can get to it on YouTube, or no, iPlayer if you want, and it's such an interesting little snippet. But I mean, Nilsson Mead have gone on to great things. Didn't get funded on Dragon's Den. They've gone on to great things, and you can get it everywhere. So it shows an example of I don't know, just what television exposure will do for you. But yeah, it's an interesting little nugget.
So from your perspective, if we're going to wrap all this story up from not necessarily debunking, but showing that, you know, the synonymous, you know, the unique or exclusive or primary connection is fictive, and yes, it was an early medieval drink. If we take that story right through to the present day, what is the takeaway big story here? I mean, this shows us how the past is being consumed, commercialized, or, you know, as part of that is not necessarily a lie, but a misrepresentation, a skirting of a different story. I mean, what do you think are the implications for this for people?
I mean, sure, there are a number of these. I mean, firstly, I suppose the first thing is this is yet another example of how spectacularly good the Vikings are at selling things. At the commodification of the Vikings, they're amazing.
If they were still around, they'd be making a packet.
They really, yeah, they absolutely would. Their image, or the image which we have created of them, that malleable image that we want to believe in, that is selling us something, and we attach the word Vikings to it. But basically, we want to have a hyper masculine, slightly scary sort of figure that we can use and that we can play with and that we can laugh at. And if we can shove that into the past and call it a Viking, then great, because it means that we don't have to deal with all of the unpleasantness of actually having these sorts of figures around. It's safely somewhere else, and it means that, and that can then be used, and you can be played with, and can be used to sell things or create cartoons or whatever you want to do with it. It's that infinite malleability of the Vikings. So that's one thing to say first of all, and I mean, this is just one example of many examples of the Vikings being used to sell things. But in terms of I suppose in terms of the drink, I don't think I would be quite as harsh as to say that it's trading on a lie. No. I think what I'd say is that just as in the 10th century, 11th century, whatever it may be, with Beowulf, looking back to an idealized golden age and expressing that in terms of the consumption of this sort of weird, slightly mythological, this drink of another age, of another place.
It's always been otherworldly then, in a sense, and a bit nostalgic.
It has always been otherworldly and nostalgic, and I don't think there is any change in the way that we are direct inheritors of that sort of nostalgia, of that creation of mead as being this symbol of something else, of that heroic warrior society, which is mythical in the Beowulf period, is mythical when it's in the Eddic picture of Valhert. And it's a nice thing to think about. I mean, it's an example would be, so take James Bond. If you looked at James Bond, you might believe that typically people have martinis, which are shaken, not stirred. Most people don't drink martinis, which are shaken, not stirred. But it's a sort of mythical idea of a good life that everybody recognizes is just it's not real. It's a fantasy, but you can play on that, and that's sort of the poetic language, the poetic terms in which mead is always placed in our early medieval sources. I think slightly has an echo in our sort of in the poetic way that we think of it as this drink of the past, that it's this sort of drink of I mean, maybe a better time. I mean, there's all sorts of value judgments there about which are highly questionable, but of a time that we can fantasize about and play with and have as a pleasant ideal. But we're doing exactly the same thing as the Beowulf poet or Snorri or whoever is producing that sort of Eddic picture of Norse mythology. So I think it's I'm definitely not wagging my finger at people drinking mead and in the most Viking-like way that they can. Whatever. I mean, I'm not saying no, you're wrong. I'm saying that the evidence that the Vikings, whatever that means, probably drank mead. Some Vikings at some time drank mead, but far more importantly, it's this sort of idealistic component of a particular society that they wanted to celebrate.
I suppose, like with all things to do with the Vikings that are floating our popular culture and catnip to white supremacists, it's not so much that the factual correction of it's more of being able to critique the times and places where mead is part of those extremist political ideologies and their attempts to racialize that worry me. It's not that mead, it's like another way in which you can dog whistle or package your bigotry if you say, well, this is the authentic drink of the Vikings that my ancestors drank, and most people aren't making it. Most people are not intellectual infants, but these people are, and that's the way they think about things. So it's not saying, most of the time it's just an aesthetic. It's a bit of an aura of pastness that's being floated around, linked to a commodity to be sold, and it's relatively harmless in terms of that. But there are still people that will link it to a bigger sort of nexus of tropes and ideals that and take it somewhere vile and hateful.
Absolutely, yes, and there's a link. I mean, there is both a sort of racial thing going on there. There is also a sexist thing,
yes.
and a construction of these. A sort of portrayal of the Vikings as these men who are real men, and part of an aspect of that is their ability to hold their drink, and that sits in there with the it makes it, if you start thinking about it, it makes you uneasy. There is I'm perfectly happy to pick my mead up here and drink it, whether or not that's a Viking thing or not. But at that point, when you start to think about the transaction that's going on and the buying into a particular idea about masculinity, about drink, something that links northern descent, whatever that may mean, or that northern blood, that sort of revolting racist dimension on all of this, and a heritage from the Vikings, and the sorts of people who to whom they will drink in mead to their Viking forebears. That's when it all starts to become very, very suspect indeed. And very worrying, very troubling, and home to some really pernicious ideology.
Yes.
And so it's really, but the same act of drinking mead could be perfectly innocuous and perfectly innocent, and could be deeply horrible. And it's the way in which it's being done, which determines how it's to be understood. Which is troubling for anybody who is. It's troubling for me as a Vikings historian that it is used by all sorts of dreadful people for their own end, for their own pernicious political ends. But it doesn't stop me doing it. And it makes me want to carve out particular knowledge and understanding of what these people, who these people are, why they are doing it, and of why of the fact that it is perfectly possible to enjoy the Vikings and not be these terrible people.
And I think that's what good scholarship can do. It gives people the information, the perspective, the nuance, and the complexity of an evolving modern reception that is not fake, but equally is a construction of our times. And that doesn't mean that anyone who engages with it is somehow tainted by some sort of poisonous. There's always going to be that co-option and misuse, but it's about understanding, giving people the skills to read this information, and that's what great research like yours is able to help people with. And that's why we have so many exciting pieces of research on the Viking Age that tack back and forth between the past, the reconstructed our investigations of the early Middle Ages and our imagined ideas. And I think that's really healthy and a really constructive way of looking at it, Simon. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Completely. Thanks very much, Howard.
I mean, for me, this is just really, really exciting stuff. The links will be in the comment section. I don't know if you have any final insights or words you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners, or do you think we've covered everything in your journey? I've tried to keep the puns out of my conversation, bar one, but we shall make one into the title, I'm sure. And but is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Actually, yes, there is.
Okay.
Final point, which is stir fry with it. Mead and stir fries really works. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's an interesting little thing. I also, since I've been when I do this research, when I start writing on this stuff, I always end up just thinking, oh, I could have some mead. Actually, I wouldn't mind some mead. And so I have a bit about, but I have really found it works, and a relatively sweet mead will work quite well in a stir fry. But yeah, put it in as one of your ingredients in there, and it's lovely. Yeah, thoroughly recommended.
Wow, there you are. So from detailed research into the origins of a drink and its Viking associations to recipe advice, it's everything is happening on Archaeodeath. And
you get it all.
So thank you so much, Simon. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure, and so many insights here. And I look forward to reading your forthcoming, as well as going back to the chapter I've already looked at where you've tackled this. It's really exciting stuff, and we need more alcohol archaeology and history. I think more boozing in the past. But thank you.
I'll drink to that. Thanks very much indeed, Howard.
Cheers.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.